Hello? Yeah, it is. I guess you all heard my introduction earlier in the worship service, but Joan is a longtime member here and wonderful human. And I've seen this presentation in a version one time and it was excellent. So I hope you enjoyed as much as we did.
Thank you. Do you want me to stand? Whatever. I'll just stand right here and see if this works. All right. Can you hear me? Nope. Steve, do you want me to use this one? Or you want me to just use the microphone? Okay. All right. Well, thank you for having me here to talk to you today. Um, I want to just give a little bit of background about myself and give a nod to Joanne Beats, who started the focus here on racism. And Joanne, in my mind, I call you our moral matriarch. And I'm serious. But you encouraged us in the early 2000s to focus on racism. And I think you and Maury Geiger, odd sound coming here, took an anti-racism study dialogue circle together before we held one at Peace. And 2007, we held that study here in the fall, and a number of people took place in it, about a dozen people, I believe. And that was sort of my beginning journey on learning about slavery and racism in our country. We continue here with our Race Forward group led by Ruth to study racism. And Ed and I have been lucky enough to travel in some cities that intersect with the Civil Rights Trail. Our travel wasn't necessarily planned as one trip to follow the Civil Rights Trail, but we visited a number of cities on that. So this book is a good resource, and I'll pass it around if you want to look at it. Um, do I just prompt? Do I just prompt for the next slide? Yeah. We can advance to the next slide. So this is a map of the Civil Rights Trail in that book, and I'm going to highlight 6 cities that we visited, 3 last October, and then 3 cities that we visited earlier. Um, so let's go ahead and advance to the next slide. Last October, Ed and I did a road trip to Charleston, which is a major city on the Civil Rights Trail, but we visited friends there. I'm not going to lift up spots in Charleston. But on our way home, we intentionally visited Montgomery, Birmingham, and Memphis. So let's advance to the next slide. Each of the cities I'm going to talk about, I'm going to just sort of list the places we visited that I want to raise up, and then some of the major historical events that took place in those cities. So in Montgomery, we started with the Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. Both of those are operated by the Equal Justice Initiative. And then we did stop at the Freedom Rides Museum. Major historical events in Montgomery. There, I'm sure you're familiar with the Montgomery bus boycott, which started with Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the front of the bus. It took place over a year, from the end of 1955 to the end of 1956. I was born in 56. This isn't old history. Well, maybe I'm old, but it doesn't feel old to me. And then the Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights March was in 1965, and that ended on the steps of the Alabama State Capitol. And the Freedom Riders stopped in Montgomery and were brutally attacked. So next slide, we'll get started. This is the Legacy Museum, From Enslavement to Mass Incarceration. It's a newish museum, opened in 2018, and it's really focused on truth-telling and teaching a fuller history of our country that many of us aren't familiar with. Okay, next slide. It's operated by the Equal Justice Initiative. This is Brian Stevenson, the executive director of that organization and author of Just Mercy, which we read together a few years ago. Yeah, good book. Okay. There are 4 themes in this museum that are explored in depth: enslavement, racial terrorism and lynching, Jim Crow, segregation, and mass incarceration. And I'm just going to give you a little sample from each of those galleries. Okay. The first one centered on enslavement. This organization has done a lot of research. There were maps, many maps, that really documented the different transatlantic slave journeys that were made to the different cities in our country. Lots of details about numbers of people who were brought, forced over date lines. I learned a number of things, or reminded of a number of things. The transatlantic slave trade was abolished in 1808, but of course that wasn't the end of slavery. It just became domestic and internal. Slavery existed in all colonies, even in the Northeast, although they abolished slavery sooner than the Southeast. It existed in all colonies. And for example, in New York, in 1817, they passed legislation banning slavery, and 10 years later, in 1827, that was the date of final emancipation, and that was the first state to pass a law for total abolition of slavery. Okay. This is the passageway into that enslavement gallery. There's world-class art and sculptures in this museum, as well as videos in each of the galleries, interactive displays, audio, and this is one of the most moving pieces of artwork, I think. Okay. The second gallery was on racial terrorism and lynching, and this museum really uses the word racial terrorism when referring to lynching. I think words matter and can make a difference in our understanding. 4,400 lynchings have been documented of Black people from 1877 to 1950. 800 more than had previously been recognized based on research done here. And racial terrorism has inflicted deep trauma and psychological wounds on survivors, witnesses, family members, and the entire African American country. Next slide. This was another exhibit in that gallery called the Community Remembrance Project. And what you see here, all these different colors of soil, there are 800 jars of soil that has been collected from the counties in our country with known lynchings. Okay. Moving into the third gallery on Jim Crow segregation, this was an exhibit on the Montgomery bus boycott, giving images of just a few of the people who participated in that bus boycott. One of my memories of learning more about the bus boycott while we were there was that, and I might have learned this in Birmingham, it doesn't matter, but the communities were completely segregated. And during the bus boycott, funeral homes, Black funeral homes, were lending the use of their hearses to help get people to work. Okay, this was another exhibit. This is just a piece of the wall, but it was a huge wall of signs that have been collected from around the country, demonstrating our codified racial segregation. I forgot to mention, photography was not allowed in this museum, so these photos have been lifted from the web. They're not all. That one, no, none of these could have been mine because you weren't allowed to take pictures. I did see other people there with notebooks so they could take notes as they went through. So if you're able to visit, Tom Neer said he was going to visit, and Marie, come and sit. That might be something you'd want to do. Okay. And then another exhibit here, the visitor is allowed to take a poll test. And you had to answer all of the questions right in order to register to vote. And these are just some sample questions. And it's just, they were impossible. How many seeds are in a watermelon? How many bubbles in a bar of soap? Print a word forwards and backwards, that looks the same. Just ludicrous. The fourth gallery was on mass incarceration. And if I can get my words right here, this museum really puts forth the premise that we have just moved into a new era of slavery, is what they'll say. Our country has the largest prison population in the world. This gallery features voices of people wrongly condemned, unjustly sentenced, and unjustly treated in our legal system. And in this exhibit, you could pick up a phone and listen to the stories of the different people that were featured here. There were maybe a dozen different people featured. Okay, we're going to leave the museum, and Ed and I took a shuttle to this memorial. You could walk, it's about a mile away. It's the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. Again, this is also operated by the Equal Justice Initiative, and it's dedicated specifically to the memory of the 4,400 victims of lynching. Here we see 800 steel monuments, one for each county where lynchings took place. And on the, see if this works, looking backwards. You can see names inscribed on these monuments. So what county they're from and the names, and some of them have so many names there on both sides. I didn't get teary when I practiced this. Minnesota's not exempt. So these 3 people lost their lives in a lynching in Duluth. I didn't expect to get emotional here. Yeah. All right. If there's one place you can visit, it would be here, I think. If you had to choose of any place to visit those 2 places. We had time to go to the Freedom Rides Museum in Montgomery. In 1961, a group of volunteers, mostly college students, crossed racial barriers in depots and on-board buses. And they were challenging the practice of segregated interstate travel throughout the South. They didn't start or end in Montgomery, but there was a stop here in 1961 at the Greyhound bus station where they were attacked. And it was so brutal that it got the Kennedy administration involved, and they sent U.S. Marshals. Okay. We spent so much time at the Legacy Museum and the Memorial that we got here right when it was closing. But it's worth your visit if you can go. This is the Greyhound bus station that was there. There are outside exhibits here, photos and stories about the history of that. And right over Ed's shoulder, I'll talk about that doorway that's been bricked up. It was once the colored entrance to the Greyhound bus station that led to separate everything. Bathrooms, lunch counter, ticket window. And I just read yesterday, I believe, that often the portion for African Americans would not be cleaned regularly. They might even be closed, so that if you're doing a long interstate bus trip and the lunch counter is closed, then what resulted was the people brought their own food often, and stories have been passed down about the kind of food they brought along on their bus travels. Okay. 2 other spots in Montgomery, if you're there. There's the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where King was pastor from 54 to 60. And remember, the bus strike started in 55, and King was really instrumental in leading that and organizing it, and this church was the backbone of that. He'd only been pastor there for a year or 2. And he was born in 29. He was a young man. He was in his 20s. Okay. And that church is right across the street from the Capitol building. And the Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights March ended here at the steps of the Capitol, and King addressed 25,000 people at the end of that march. Okay, we're going to leave Montgomery and travel on I-65 going north to Birmingham, and we see a Confederate flag in 2022. I did the math. I think it's 150 some years after the end of the Civil War, but we still see this being flown in our country. We're going to go to Birmingham. It was nicknamed Bombingham. It was the most segregated city in America in the early 60s. We visited the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, the 16th Street Baptist Church, and Kelly Ingram Park. They're all close to each other, right across the street or kitty corner from each other. Major events in Birmingham really took place in 1963. There was the 1963 Birmingham campaign led by leaders such as Fred Shuttlesworth, Ralph Abernathy, and A.G. Gaston, who was a well-to-do black businessman in Birmingham. There were mass meetings, nonviolent protests, lunch counter sit-ins. This was considered the turning point in the national civil rights movement, and is believed to have contributed to the signing of the Civil Rights Act in '64. King was jailed in Birmingham in 1963 over Easter, and that's when he wrote the letter from a Birmingham jail. I didn't know this, but enthusiasm was waning at that point in the crusade, in the Civil Rights Crusade, and there was a controversial decision made to involve children the next month after King was jailed. And in May of '63 was the Children's Crusade. And then in September of that year, the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed. Okay. This is the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. It's a national memorial now. It's newer, established in 2017, administered by the National Park Service. I'll just highlight a few of the exhibits there. They had a number of galleries. One was the Barriers Gallery, where they focus on segregated schools, voting rights, stereotypes, and black images. Okay. Attitudes and ideas influence how people of different races and backgrounds see each other. Although they're painful to look at, these everyday objects tell the story of how the African American image was distorted by whites. They embody a myth of white supremacy that shaped race relations throughout the 20th century and beyond, I believe. So, anybody else remember Aunt Jemima? Yeah. They had an exhibit on voting rights, and on the left you see a woman registering to vote, and on the right is a black woman holding an Alabama voting certificate in 1965. That was the year the Voting Rights Act was passed. And then the Children's March. 1,000 students skipped class on May 2nd and gathered at the 16th Street Baptist Church and marched downtown. The next day, they were jailed. Next day, more kids marched. And at its peak, about 2,500 kids were jailed. Commissioner of Public Safety Eugene Bull Connor ordered the use of dogs to attack the children protesters. Okay. And the use of high-powered fire hoses. Yes, Stevie?
Like an average age for those kids that were?
I'd be guessing if I did. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think they were toddlers from pictures. The attacks on the protesters were so horrific that it gained world attention and condemnation, forced the white leaders to desegregate downtown and end discrimination in employment, or at least on paper, and it started. Okay. Across the street is the 16th Street Baptist Church that got bombed in September. That Sunday was their youth Sunday, so I sort of, in my mind, think of our rally Sundays, where there's a lot of excitement, you're getting a new year started. The kids were involved. They were running the church service, and it got bombed. This is really just an aside, but at the time of the civil rights movement, the congregation was really big. It's much smaller now. I want to point out this spot right here, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I was able to take photos in the sanctuary, not in the basement where a lot of the tour took place, that they've got set up to really go through the history. But this congregation from its beginning was associated with Birmingham's professional and upper class. And with something to lose, there was a lot of resistance to joining the civil rights movement. And we were told teachers that belonged to the congregation would be fired if the congregation was associated with any participation in the movement. When the Reverend John Cross came to be pastor, that changed. He had a relationship with King, who persuaded him to let the church be used as a meeting place. Okay. This is the marker I pointed that's on the outside of the church now. There used to be an external stairway, and under that stairway is where the bomb was planted by the KKK. There were 3 other women on the tour with us, and at the end of the tour, they said that one of the children killed was their cousin. Yeah. All right, moving to Kelly Ingram Park, which is just kitty corner from the church. That's an assembly point for sit-ins, boycotts, marches taking place to end segregation. There is a lot of sculpture in this park commemorating some of those events. This is of the 4 girls who died. And sculpture of a dog being used to attack. Okay, we're going to go to Memphis. Here we visited the National Civil Rights Museum and a very tiny museum called Slave Haven Underground Railroad. The events we focus on in Memphis were in 1968. There was a strike by the black sanitation workers to demand better pay and working conditions. And what really sparked the strike was 2 workers got killed in a work accident with a garbage truck. And King lends his support to their strike. He comes to visit in March, and he came back in April. He delivered his mountaintop speech there, and the next day was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel. The museum is connected with the Lorraine Motel, and this is where King was staying when he was there to support the strike, and it's one of the few motels where blacks could stay in Memphis in 1968. This, the room where you see the wreath is where he was staying. Okay. One of the first exhibits we got to see while there was a traveling exhibit on the Rosenwald School project. And I'm going to lift you up some information about this project because I had never heard of it, and maybe you haven't. It was a collaboration between Booker T. Washington, Julius Rosenwald, who led Sears and Roebuck, and black communities across the South. This was one of the first Jewish-black collaborations. And what we see pictured here is the first Rosenwald School in North Carolina. Okay. This, the Rosenwald Project built nearly 5,000 schools across the South from 1912 to 1937 and helped educate the generation that would become leaders and advocates of the civil rights movement. It was beloved by the black community, and these schools were in high regard. And these are some of the alumni of the Rosenwald schools. Yeah, wow, that's impressive. What a legacy, you know. So just a few photos from some of the other exhibits. This was entitled The Year They Walked, the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and that's Rosa Parks in the front of the bus. one of the Freedom Rides buses that was burned, and this exhibit was titled, "We Are Prepared to Die." This was from their exhibit on Voting Rights Act, and so what it's pointing out is the increase in number of people registered to vote from 1960 to 68. So look at Mississippi. And the gray bar is number of people registered in 1960, and then the gold bar in 1966 after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. We can't read that, but it's almost 600% increase. Okay. And of course they had an exhibit on the Memphis sanitation strike. And after King was assassinated, President Johnson stepped into pressure Memphis officials to quickly settle the strike, and it was settled 12 days after his death on April 16th. Okay. The other place we visited, it's a very small spot called the Slave Haven Underground Railroad Museum, but it left an impact on me, so I'm going to tell you about it. The Underground Railroad helped thousands escape to freedom to the north, and after 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, escape all the way to Canada. Jacob Burkle was a German immigrant. It's believed that his family hid escaped slaves in their root cellar. There's no evidence to support that, but on the other hand, it was the nature of the Underground Railroad to be secret. And regardless, I believe the museum does a good job of highlighting the brutality of the slave trade and the ingenuity and bravery of enslaved people to escape. Just some facts about the slave ship passage. It was brutal. They really were wanting young bodies that could work. We saw a picture of bodies stacked on shelves, and we're told they were chained 23 hours a day. They also talked about the trauma and anguish of families being torn apart. Older kids might be sold with their parents, but the babies maybe not. They could be left for the end. They would be raised by wet nurses. The babies were the least valuable. They couldn't work yet. And so a buyer might buy several babies at the end of the day for cheap. This was a very tiny, it was his house. We weren't allowed to take pictures inside, but next slide, you can see the house. This was a 1-hour tour, guided tour. Okay, and then I'll just talk about some of the other things we learned. You've probably heard reading and writing was not allowed by enslaved people. If they could read and write, they might be able to write their own freedom papers. And we saw an image of a man who lost his hands as a result, as a punishment. But in the photo, he was holding a pen between the stubs of his arms, still writing. Enslaved people found alternate ways of communicating through songs and spirituals, quilt patterns, artifacts such as a lantern outside a home hanging on statuary. Is it on or off? That would be a signal of whether or not it's safe to approach. And then the symbolism in some of the spirituals. Swing low, swing meaning to run. Low meaning stay hidden, don't be seen. Chariot represents a vehicle or your feet, a means of escape. Coming for to carry me home, home meaning freedom. I looked over Jordan, the River Jordan being the Ohio River. Band of angels coming after me, angels being abolitionists. Okay. Ed says, why'd you put this in there? We don't see cotton here, and cotton's still a big crop in the South, and of course it was a significant crop during our years of slavery. Okay. Of course it's a lot of machinery used now. All right, quickly I'm going to take you to 3 other cities that we visited, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, and Little Rock. Ed was at conferences during a couple of these, so some of these explorations I did on my own, and D.C. being one of them. We visited the Martin Luther King Memorial, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and the National Portrait Gallery. Significant events in D.C., the Supreme Court decision in '54, Brown versus Board of Education, desegregating schools. In '63, the March on Washington occurred, and King delivered his I Have a Dream speech. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and then we elected our first black president in 2008. This is the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial. When we visited, I don't know how I didn't realize this, but this piece of stone that King is carved from came from this larger piece. And he's on, they call it the Stone of Hope, and it's taken from the Mountain of Despair, symbolizing victory born from disappointment. And to the right of King, you can see just one wall that's got a quote from him, but there were a lot of panels that had quotes from King around his memorial. Okay. I'm just quickly going to take you through DC. This is the National Museum of African American Culture and History and Culture. It's part of the Smithsonian. It was new when we were there. There were lines, and you had to get sort of a ticket to go in. I don't know if you still have to do this. It opened in 2016. And I'm just some memories, some lingering impressions. The King exhibit seemed small to me, and the Malcolm X exhibit was more prominent. And then they have an Emmett Till memorial there that contains the open metal casket used to display Till's body after his brutal lynching in '55. And you can see that room is sort of more enclosed than some of the other areas. They have images of Till's body, which are very difficult to look at. But his mother insisted they be made public. But you have to intentionally go into that exhibit to see it. All right. And then the last place I highlight is the National Portrait Gallery, also part of the Smithsonian. It's maybe one of the last Smithsonian museums I visited. I think I thought it sounded boring. It's really quite interesting. And in the portrait gallery, the portraits of Barack and Michelle had just recently been put up. So it was sort of fun to get to see those. Barack, of course, being our first black president, and Michelle being a descendant of enslaved black people. And these were pretty new when I was there, so there were lines of people waiting to get up close, and then they'd be taking pictures of their kids in front of them, which was sweet. I'm going to go to Atlanta now. We visited the National Center for Civil and Human Rights and the MLK National Historic Park. Significant events in Atlanta really are centered around King. He was born there in '29. He was ordained there. He returns in 1960 from Montgomery, where he was pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and he co-pastors with his father until his death at Ebenezer Baptist Church. Okay. This is the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. I'm just going to raise up one exhibit there. I think it's pretty well known, but it's also very unique. And that's the lunch counter protest simulation. So visitors here can take a seat at the lunch counter, put on headphones. You're instructed to put your hands flat on the counter, close your eyes, and you hear threats and racial intimidation, and you feel kicking around your seats as the exhibit jumps and bumps to simulate violence. And you are challenged to remain seated if you can and avoid reacting, because the lunch counter protests were nonviolent.
What was that? Did you actually do it?
Yeah, I did it, yeah.
What was it like for you?
Well, it's hard. It's hard. It really, strives to make you feel empathy, to try to understand what it felt like. Yeah. Then we will go to the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Park. The Visitor Center has very good displays and information. I'm not going to highlight any of those. But it oversees his birth home, the historic Fire Station Number 6, and Ebenezer Baptist Church. And they are across the street from that visitor center. This is the home where King was born in 29. He lived here till he was 12. His family shared this home with his maternal grandparents. And his maternal grandfather was a pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church even before King's father was. This is the church. Like I said, he was ordained here, he co-pastored, and his funeral was held here. Okay. Last stop, Little Rock, Arkansas. We visited there January of last year. We visited the Little Rock Central High School National Historic Site and the Clinton Presidential Library and Museum. Significant events in Little Rock really center over desegregation. So I mentioned the Supreme Court ruled in '54 that school segregation was unconstitutional. The Little Rock School Board approves an integration plan in '57. In the fall of that year, the governor orders the Arkansas National Guard to block the black students' entry. There's a lot of ugly stuff that happens. I'm sure you've seen pictures. Several weeks later, Eisenhower sends the Army and National Guardsmen, and on September 25th, it's the first day that the Little Rock Nine could attend their first full day of classes. The next year, so they did attend for the year. One of the students was a senior and graduated. The next year, the governor closes all the high schools in protest of integration. It's known as the lost year. And they were ordered to reopen in the summer of that year, so that they did resume. And then Clinton, in 1999, awards a Congressional Gold Medal to the Little Rock Nine. So these are the 9 students that integrated Little Rock Central High School. So Ed says, everybody know what the Little Rock Nine are? They're the 9 teenagers that were the first African American students to enter the high school. Okay, this is the Visitor Center. It's really good. I'm not going to lift up any exhibits there, but if you can visit, start here. And then kitty corner from the Visitor Center is the high school. Okay, what do you think of this high school? Pretty impressive, right? Maybe that's got something to do with the protesting the integration. It opened in 1927. It cost $1.5 million back in 1927. It was one of the largest and most expensive high schools in the country, and it was named America's most beautiful high school by the American Institute of Architects. I think it gives context, maybe, to understand how beautiful and awesome this high school was to the blowback. All right, an image of some of the students leaving school for the day with protection. And then there is a memorial of the Little Rock Nine at the Arkansas State Capitol. I think only 8 are pictured here, but there were 9. Ed counted. He's like, I don't know why that. Maybe that photo just didn't have all of them. All right, last stop that I'll talk about is the Clinton Presidential Library and Museum. And there is, I highlight this, it is part of the Civil Rights Trail, but also there is an exhibit on the Little Rock Nine there at that museum. So, yeah, it's an ongoing journey for me to continuously be learning about our whole history. And it's always a struggle to find ways to put beliefs into action. I've just given you a sampler here today. I hope it encourages you, if you have the chance, to go explore on your own. And there are many more places to explore that I haven't talked about today, but any questions? Sort of ran through this.
One
Mhm.
which is
Yeah, yeah.
Can you repeat that for anyone online?
The pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church is now a U.S. Senator. Yeah, Karen,
I want to thank you for doing this.
you're welcome.
Wonderful presentation. What I think of as I'm watching this is that the legacy of slavery has been passed down and is carried by our young people today.
Hmm.
And I think about our children in Project Legacy who attempt to go on to school and all the barriers they faced coming out of the deep south or even the north.
Hmm.
And, you know, just a little thing like not being able to own property and that passage of wealth through
Hmm.
generations.
Hmm.
Not being able to get a quality education because you're homeless most of your life. And so I want to thank the church for supporting Project Legacy, making those donations so that we can help to lift those young people up so that they have the opportunities all of us here have.
Hmm.
This is just so powerful. And I think like Joan said, if anyone ever has the opportunity to go and see this, just an amazing thing to realize it wasn't that long ago. It was
No,
not that
yeah.
long ago.
Hmm. Yeah.
How did you feel after this, sort of depressed or encouraged?
It was hard. It was hard. It's hard because there's still such a long way to go. And progress has been made, undeniably, but there's just still so much we have to do. We spent, if there's one place to choose to go visit, go to Montgomery, go to the Legacy Museum and the Memorial. Granted, it was our first stop in October, but we spent the most time there. That has so much impact. Where was I going with this? But, so we spent like 5 hours. It was hard. We took a break while visiting the Legacy Museum. They have a wonderful restaurant there. So we did take a break. We needed a break. So we did 2 galleries, took a lunch break, and then went back and did more. If you could spread it out over a little bit longer time than so compact, it might be easier, but it was intense. The other cities we visited have been not just back to back to back, like those first 3 that I talked about.
Describe in that lynching museum how the monuments are. I think that's really powerful. They're hanging from the ceiling, right?
The steel monuments are hanging. Yep. Yeah. And you can, some of them are hanging up higher and you're walking underneath, and some you're walking in between where you can really, I had a photo of Ed standing by one that I took out, but where he's reading the names. That memorial has a lot more to it even than those those monuments that are so moving. They've got an exhibit that talks about this project they're trying to do where they're going around to each of the counties and collecting soil and putting up a plaque at the location of the lynching, where family survivors are participating in that. And there are coffin-style monuments in the back. So there's more to this memorial even than this picture I'm showing you, which is very moving. So, yeah. Anybody else?
I'd like to make a comment. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the courage that you and Ed shown in going to all these places. I want to honor your emotion that you have about it. However, say I'm empathetic because when I was down in Georgia myself, I spent a year at Jubilee Partners in a Christian community, and I visited death row in Georgia. My parents and a lot of my associates are intellectually against the death penalty. But when you go in to the visiting room and those doors close behind you and you feel the jumpiness of the guards and you feel the pain of the inmates who are given a death sentence, you have a whole different feeling about the issue. And so when I was on my way down there, we were joking and laughing and having a good time. When we were coming back, we almost couldn't even talk in the car. The next day, the whole community I was associated with went to the Atlanta Zoo, and I took an axe and split firewood. I was so angry about the death penalty, and when I talked to my dad about it, he couldn't understand why I was so upset, because for years he'd been against the death penalty. But it's one thing to know in your head, but it's another thing to feel it in your heart. And so when you went to these places, you just couldn't.
Somebody's resurrected this photo of Ed. They have an exhibit in the Legacy Museum of letters that have been written to the Equal Justice Initiative by inmates, imploring, begging for help. Yeah.
So I just want to thank you for your courage and your willingness to go on this journey, and I really appreciate you bringing.
Yeah, you're welcome.
this back.
I talked to Tom Neer before church today, and he and Marie are going to stop in Montgomery on their way to Florida pretty soon. So, all right, thank you.